The first time Caleb walked into town with snow still on his hat and steam rising from his coat, men laughed like they always did, but this time he didn't flinch. He just stood there with that far-off mountain stare, set a bushel of dry firewood on the saloon steps, and said quietly, "You can bring the rest down yourself. My cabin's still warm." Then he turned and left, same as always. Only this time no one followed him with a smirk. No one dared to joke, because everyone else's chimneys had frozen over the night before. Fires were dead, pipes burst. One child had near lost his fingers to frostbite. But Caleb still had steam rising off his coat, and that was when they remembered. His cabin wasn't normal, not by a long shot. It started the winter after his father died. Caleb wasn't more than 23, quiet sort, built like a tree stump and spoke like he was raised underground. Folks remembered the old man, Jedediah Rivers, who'd lived up there in the northern ridge where the wind didn't just blow, it cut. The cabin he left behind was strange enough. Tall, narrow, just one room stacked above another, like someone had taken a regular homestead and tipped it up on end, then laid out plank stairs outside like they were climbing to heaven. Folks said Jed built it like that because he was half mad and hated digging foundations, said the wind couldn't tear at a house that narrow, said the ground stayed warmer if you didn't spread across it. Caleb never argued, just went back up after the burial with 2 mules, a crosscut saw, and 4 cords of firewood. He didn't come down until spring. That first year, it didn't draw much attention. He'd always been odd, always off in the woods, building things that leaned wrong or curved where they shouldn't. But then came that brutal frost in '78, took the Lambert twins, cracked their stove clean in half, froze poor Eliza Penner's whole root cellar solid. The town doctor had to amputate. Folks began looking up toward Caleb's ridge like it might be hiding something. And then someone saw it, a trail of steam, rising in coils from a stovepipe nearly 50 feet above the tree line, perched on what looked like the 3rd story of that madman's tower. No one had a house that high, not out here. One of the lumber hands, Garrett, hiked up to see for himself, came back red-faced and quiet, said the bottom room felt like a regular cabin, the 2nd level was warmer, and the 3rd, like sitting in a summer barn, he whispered, like he couldn't believe it, didn't see no 2nd stove neither. That was when the jokes began. They said Caleb must be stacking rooms because he didn't know where to sleep, said he was trying to build a chimney to the sun, said maybe he was trying to get closer to heaven without dying first. But under the laughs, you could hear the wonder, because no one else's cabin ran warm on less than half the firewood, and nobody could explain how his place didn't leak heat like a sieve with the wind tearing at it from every side. One spring, Caleb came down for nails and beans. He didn't say much, but the general store owner, old Bexley, asked him plain, "That chimney cabin yours? How's it stay so warm?" Caleb looked at him like he'd asked how to breathe. "Heat rises," he said. "Just gave it room to climb." Then he left. It didn't make sense, not to most folks, but some started trying. Elijah Moats tried stacking barrels of water behind his stove to catch the heat. Didn't work. The Holloway boys nailed tarps across their ceiling to trap warm air. Their cabin caught fire. Folks went back to laughing at Caleb, but it sounded a little more hollow each time, especially after '81. That was the year of the Black Winter. 3 months of snow, wind hard enough to rip the bark from trees, 10 below for 5 nights straight. Men buried horses where they froze standing. One widow suffocated from smoke after her chimney choked up and her firewood smoked back into the house. The town lost 6 people before January ended, but Caleb, he came down on foot every 2 weeks, hauling bundles of kindling and smoked meat. His beard was thick with ice, but his hands were bare, and his eyes never squinted from the cold, just clear, open, blinking slow like a man in late spring. Someone finally followed him back. No one ever confessed to it. But one morning there were tracks, fresh in the snow, leading up the ridge to Caleb's land and then back down again. Whoever it was didn't steal anything, didn't knock. But the next week, Caleb started finding bundles of split wood at the foot of his hill, knotted cloth bags with biscuits and matches, quiet offerings, silent apologies. The town had stopped laughing, and they'd started watching, because now they wanted to know how. How did a man live at the top of the ridge, in the worst wind on the frontier, without a double-stone stove, or a root cellar, or an attic full of insulation? How could he stack rooms like stairs and come out warmer with each level? Caleb never said much, but they noticed things. Each room had its own door, but no windows. The lowest level was sunk halfway into the earth, like a dugout with a doorframe. Thick logs, packed mud between. One wood stove only, in the center of the bottom floor, fat and round like a cast-iron barrel. But what mattered wasn't the stove. It was the holes, vents more like, shallow shafts carved straight up through the ceiling, with hollow logs around them, funneling air into the room above. No flues, no pipes, just smooth channels, warm air climbing like smoke. And above that, another room, same layout, only warmer. Each level acted like a cap on the last, trapping heat in steps. The topmost floor, smallest and highest, held a cot, a shelf, and nothing more. It felt like summer in there, even with ice on the eaves, and when the wind howled, that narrow cabin didn't budge. It just hummed, like every plank had been braced against the storm instead of beaten by it. Some swore they felt the heat rising through their boots just standing on the bottom rung of his stair. The town still whispered, but now it was with awe. Men started asking him to come look at their homes. Just a glance, nothing formal. Caleb never charged, never advised. He just stared. Quiet, eyes darting toward ceiling beams, stove placement, vent holes, then nodded and left. But those glances changed cabins. One man added a second floor and swore it cut his firewood use by a third. Another bricked in a wall and vented his stove upward, said it warmed his children's room better than ever before. A carpenter tried to copy Caleb's design and failed. The rooms held no heat unless they were sealed just right. But still, something had shifted. The laughter had dried up, and the respect began to root deep, until one winter night, a storm came. That put all the others to shame. Winds above 70, trees snapped, barns lifted from their beams. The town blacked out, whole homesteads lost roofs. Smoke didn't rise, it slammed back down chimneys. By morning, 5 cabins had collapsed. Livestock froze where they stood, families bundled in basements, huddled and coughing, faces raw from cold. But Caleb, they say the steam off his cabin could be seen from 2 miles off. The ridge had become a beacon, and that morning, half the town trudged through waist-high snow up toward his hill, children in arms, men wrapped in horse blankets, old folks pulled on sleds. No one knocked. Caleb opened the bottom door before they arrived. He didn't smile. He just stepped aside and let them in. The first person through Caleb's door was old May Litchfield, her cheeks swollen with windburn, her eyes wide as a church bell. She didn't say a word, just stumbled across the threshold and stood there trembling, clutching her grandson against her chest. The boy's hands were blue, his breath was shallow. May's lips moved like she meant to say thank you, but the words wouldn't come. Her bones were too cold for speech. Behind her came the Sanders twins, bundled tight in fur wraps, their father not far behind, dragging a broken sled. Then came Merton, the blacksmith, shoulders hunched like they were trying to cover his entire family. One by one they filed in, 12, 15, 22 souls in total, until the base room of Caleb's tall, narrow cabin looked like a scene from an overturned church. Weary faces, dirt-smudged boots, shivering babies, and women crying quiet tears in the corners, warming their fingers by the iron stove that burned as if it had never heard the word blizzard. Caleb didn't speak for a long time. He let them adjust, let their breathing slow and the tears fall without judgment. He moved without a word, stoking the fire, ladling broth from a pot that hung inside a brick-ringed heat well. Near the base of the stove, one of his inventions, they'd later realize. It kept soup warm all day using the stove's residual heat and a circle of fire bricks buried deep. He gave food to children first, then the mothers, then the men. He did not eat. Once the sobbing faded and the silence grew long, he finally looked up and said, "You can sleep in shifts. Bottom's warm enough. Middle room's warmer." No one dared ask about the top. Even then, something about it felt sacred. It was Merton who finally broke the quiet. "I thought you were mad," he said, still rubbing his hands near the stove. "We all did." Caleb didn't flinch. "You weren't wrong," he said. "Madness just means seeing what don't make sense." This made sense to me. The others didn't speak, but their silence held respect now. Weight, like the wind outside, had shoved something loose in their minds. And now, all that was left was truth. Caleb moved through the crowded floor like a ghost, not bumping into a soul, setting out bedrolls and thick quilts from some hidden nook none of them had noticed. He had stacked cloth as deliberately as he'd stacked his rooms, tight-woven layers, sewn in strange overlapping patterns, insulated with dried moss and wool scraps, stitched edge to edge like a blanket made for war instead of warmth. It was Garrett, one of the lumber hands, who muttered, "Your daddy teach you all this?" Caleb shook his head slowly. "He built to survive," he said. "I built to stay warm." That night, the storm screamed louder than any before. Windows cracked in houses down the mountain. One family's cattle froze standing upright. A roof beam on the old church cracked and fell like an axe. But up in Caleb's stair-step cabin, no one felt a tremor. Heat rose in quiet curls from the stove, slipped into the shaft of the ceiling, and drifted upward, warming the second level so well it woke a baby from sleep. The child didn't cry. He just blinked and smiled, then fell back into rest. The mothers called it a miracle. Come morning, the storm was still snarling outside, but men were already whispering about the structure. They traced their hands along the walls, knocked the beams, noticed how every corner joint was double-notched and tarred, how the door frames were recessed, the floors slightly sloped so melting snow would pool to the sides. The outer walls? 2 layers, log outside, compressed wool and chink clay within, and then rough-sawn boards on the inner face. Not for beauty, for warmth. It was Bexley, the storekeep, who realized what it really was. "It's a chimney," he muttered, staring up through the vent from the bottom floor. "The whole house? It's a damn chimney." And he was right. The whole stack was designed like a flue. Air entered low, got heated and rose, passing through vents carved just wide enough to breathe, but narrow enough to trap warmth. The 3rd floor? That was the crown, the catch. The room that never dropped below 50, even when the outside world froze solid. Caleb never boasted, but when Merton asked permission to sketch it, just a few drawings so he could maybe build a version for his family, Caleb didn't say no. He just handed over a rough charcoal scribble from the corner of his shelf. It was already there, waiting. The diagram wasn't precise, but it showed enough. Vent shafts, double-walled logs, heat baffles, even a note about stuffing sheep's wool behind the inner panel boards to stop crosswinds from draining the heat. "Doesn't work," Caleb said, "unless every level seals tight. Bottom door's gotta stay shut. Stove has to stay burning low, not hot. Let the heat drift, let it climb." That stuck with them. Let it climb. By the 3rd day, folks were stirring enough to help. The kids fetched snow to melt for water. The stronger men chopped wood. One of the women started baking flatbread using a skillet she'd found in Caleb's shelf. And Caleb just kept checking on the vent shafts, clearing small clogs of ash or adjusting the felt seals around the trapdoors. It was like tending a living thing, not just a house, a system, an organism that breathed and pulsed with the warmth of the fire below. On the 4th day, the wind died. The snow stayed deep, but the world outside had quieted. That's when they saw what had really happened. From Caleb's ridge, you could see nearly the entire valley, and what they saw chilled them more than the storm. Roofs collapsed, smoke-black scars where cabins had burned, a field littered with frozen horses. The river, usually flowing even in winter, was a solid white ribbon. The church steeple leaned like a snapped neck, and the cabins, most had gone dark. That's when the guilt began. The Sanders girl cried when she saw her chimney gone. Garrett fell silent for a long time after spotting his frozen barn. Even Merton, who'd always been gruff and proud, wept when he saw the black square that used to be his smithy. No one said anything for a long while, and then May, old May, who hadn't spoken much since arriving, placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder and said, "You saved them. You saved all of us." He didn't answer. He just nodded once, slow. They left in pairs over the next week, once the roads cleared enough to move. But every single one of them came back within the month, not to stay, but to measure, to copy, to ask questions, and this time Caleb didn't turn them away. He showed them the sealing method for the vent lids. He let them feel how tightly packed the sheep's wool had to be to stop air from leaking sideways. He even led 2 of the stronger men under the base floor, into the crawl space where he'd buried 5 giant stones under the stove, river rocks that heated slowly and radiated warmth like embers even after the fire died. "Put 'em in wet," he told Merton. "Let the stove dry 'em out over weeks. Don't move 'em once. They're set." They called it the Rivers Method. It wasn't a formal name, but it spread. The stacked room trick, some called it. Others just said, "Build it like Caleb." Before spring ended, 3 cabins in the valley had been converted. 2 others were started from scratch. The church was rebuilt with a smaller version of his system, just 2 levels, but the priest said it stayed 20 degrees warmer than before, and the laughter, gone, replaced with quiet reverence, admiration, even fear in some, because some couldn't believe a man that young, that quiet, could know something so deeply about heat, wind, and shelter. Some said he was part Comanche, learned from the old cliff dwellers. Others whispered about his father, Jedediah, and said maybe the old man had been mad after all, and Caleb just inherited it and turned it into something useful. But none of that mattered the day Bexley's daughter fell ill. Late spring fever, the kind that boils the blood and melts the mind if not cooled fast. Their cabin, recently rebuilt, still ran too warm upstairs, too damp below. They tried everything, cool cloth, shade, soaking rags in melted snow, but she kept burning. It was May who ran back to the ridge, begged Caleb. He didn't ask questions. He came with a sled, blanketed it thick, carried the girl to the 2nd floor of his cabin, where the vent flow could be adjusted just right. warm enough to comfort, cool enough to stop the fever rising. He opened the trap-door vents just a crack, let the natural current flow, hung damp cloths from the ceiling rafters, built a cross breeze with nothing more than clever shaping of two opposing shafts. The fever broke, the girl lived, and now even the doubters were silent. By early summer, Caleb's Ridge had become more than a place. It was a symbol of survival, of craft, of what one man could do when he didn't care to be understood, but insisted on understanding the world around him. And as word spread, people from outside the valley started arriving. Strangers, surveyors, architects, even a newspaper man from Cheyenne who offered Caleb $20 for a full interview. He declined, but gave him a drawing. No name, no signature, just a single line of text beneath the sketch. Let the heat climb. By midsummer, a quiet procession of wagons could be seen almost daily on the ridge trail. Some came for the sketch, others came to look at the thing itself. Caleb had never wanted attention, and now he found himself the unwilling center of a slow revolution, one that replaced town gossip with blueprints, replaced laughter with the sound of hammers and chisels echoing between the trees. They didn't call it a house anymore. They called it the chimney cabin, or the three-step, or Caleb's stack. The thing wasn't just famous, it had become replicated, crude at first. Some tried to mimic it with scrap wood and old wagon planks, building lopsided towers with bad ceiling and no insulation, which promptly bled warmth and collapsed under snow load. But those who listened, really listened, began to understand that the shape alone wasn't the secret. It was discipline, a structure that tall and narrow had to be braced with intention. The weight had to press straight down into the earth, not across it. The vent holes had to be sized to an inch, not too wide or you'd lose draft, not too narrow or it'd choke. The doors couldn't be thick for comfort. They had to be flush, sealed with oiled leather hinges and layered felt, not nailed boards. And everything depended on the stove, not a raging blaze, but a low, constant hum, feeding warmth into the bones of the place like blood through veins. Caleb never said yes or no to visitors. He simply let them walk, let them look. Those who asked questions got answers, short, sometimes cryptic, but never unkind. If someone asked him why the top room stayed warm, even on windless days, he'd nod toward the shaft and say, "Because the walls, remember." If they asked how he kept the snow from choking the stovepipe, he'd say, "Don't build where the drift wins." One day, a woman from Kansas showed up, widow, maybe 40, with 3 children in tow. Her wagon was falling apart, and her face was drawn in that way that said she'd been to the edge of something and hadn't yet stepped back. She didn't ask for shelter, just wanted to see it. Her youngest clung to her leg as she stood there at the bottom of Caleb's stair-stacked cabin, eyes moving slow up the vertical silhouette, each room set back a few feet from the one below like someone had stacked timber crates against a cliff. "You don't sell these," she said quietly. Caleb shook his head. She nodded. "But you let people learn." He looked at the child, then back at her. "That one's got a winter ahead of him," he said. "Build the middle room first. Use stone under the stove. Raise it 2 feet. She did exactly that. 6 months later, that widow's cabin became the first stack built entirely by a woman in the territory. The town called it the second tower. And Caleb, he kept building. Not more cabins, just refining his own. By the second fall, he'd added a small slope-roofed annex to the base, a side entry dug into the hill like a root cellar, but vented just right to keep tools dry. He carved narrow stone steps into the floor of the crawl space beneath the main room so he could adjust the heat stones without digging. He even rigged a pulley system from the 3rd floor to hoist water buckets from the bottom level using a counterweight rope. Not because he was lazy, because movement, like heat, had to be conserved. The man lived by rules no one else had written, but others were beginning to learn them. When that next winter came, people braced themselves. They remembered the previous year, remembered what had been lost. And so in preparation, 11 homes were rebuilt using Caleb's methods, some only partial, some full towers with steep ascending layers and double-sealed walls. For the first time in the town's memory, not a single chimney cracked. Not one child was lost to frostbite. The blacksmith kept his forge warm enough to keep tools from freezing to the anvil. And Caleb, he came down only twice that winter, once to deliver a sled of smoked fish, once to bring 3 blocks of beeswax for sealing window gaps in the church. He didn't stay long either time. He didn't need to. His work was already stitched into the bones of the valley. But it wasn't until the child fell that everything changed. It was late February. The snow was softening, sun creeping longer through the trees. People were beginning to hope again. Then came the scream. A boy had slipped through a break in the ice near the mill pond. No one saw it happen, just the splash. Then silence. When they pulled him out, he wasn't breathing. Merton carried him to the church, hollering for help. The priest started prayers. The doctor shook his head. Then someone whispered, "Get Caleb." A girl, barely 9, ran the trail to the ridge without stopping once. She arrived wheezing, red-faced, half frozen. She couldn't speak, just pointed downhill. Caleb didn't ask. He grabbed his coat and went. At the church, he found the boy wrapped in 3 blankets, body still, lips pale, dead, some had already said. The doctor shook his head again, but Caleb moved faster than they'd ever seen him. He stripped the boy to his skin, wrapped him in wool, and carried him, not to the stove, not to the pews, but outside, straight back up the trail. People shouted after him, "You'll finish killing him!" But Caleb didn't slow. He reached the ridge in less than half an hour, heart thudding, breath ragged. He laid the child in the 3rd room, pulled the trap vents wide, stuffed wet wool into the floor grates below to stop draft, hung wet cloths near the ceiling to catch radiant heat. Then he waited. He sat beside the boy, hand resting on his chest. Long hours passed. Outside, no one dared knock. No one lit fires. No one dared speak loud, until, at sunset, a sound echoed from the ridge. A child's cough. Small, sharp, alive. They carried the boy down in full blankets the next day, and from that point forward, no one questioned it again. Not the heat, not the method, not the man. He'd taken a child nearly dead and warmed life back into his chest, and he'd done it with nothing but rooms stacked like stairs and fire managed like scripture. That spring, a man from Denver arrived. Clean coat, high boots, clipboard, said he worked for the Railroad Survey Bureau, said they were looking to build housing for workers in the mountain passes, and wanted Caleb's heat stack design. Caleb asked, "Will they listen?" The man smiled. "If it keeps them alive, they'll listen to anything." Caleb didn't say no. He gave them what they wanted, a 3-page drawing with notes, vents, ceiling angles, stove ratios, insulation types. But at the bottom of the last page, he added a sentence the man didn't understand. "Warmth is a shape, not a temperature." It became famous. 2 years later, dozens of cabins across the northern frontier had adopted the vertical step system. Architects began referring to it in journals. The river's stack, they called it. Passive heat rise architecture, others said. But to the town where it was born, it was always just Caleb's way, and still he never left. He added no rooms, took no wife, kept to the same ridge, walking the perimeter of his land each dawn, checking for split beams, frost lines, burrow holes. Not paranoid, just thorough, devout. The chimney cabin stood like a prayer against the wind, but even prayers eventually are tested. That summer the fire came, a dry lightning strike 10 miles west, caught a stand of pine that hadn't seen rain in months. Within hours, smoke painted the horizon black. Within days, the valley was surrounded, and the town panicked, not from the flames at first, but the smoke. Their precious cabins, their stacked rooms. They kept the heat, but now they trapped everything else. The air thickened, children coughed, breathing turned ragged, stoves were snuffed to stop drawing the haze down through the vents. People turned to Caleb again, not to beg, just to hope, and he showed them the last part of the design, one he'd never shared, the draft bleed, a tunnel, narrow, no more than 2 feet high, carved under the base of the cabin and leading out into a hidden vent in the hillside. It created a reverse pull when needed, sucking air out through the base while sealing the upward vents, pushing smoke and foul air down and away instead of drawing it in. He'd designed for more than heat. He'd designed for survival. With the town's help, they dug bleeds for 5 of the new cabins. Smoke rolled backward, down the holes, away from sleeping mouths, out through rock vents, behind fences. The people stayed inside. The fires passed around, and the cabins, Caleb's cabins, breathed through stone and earth. When it was done, the land was charred, trees blackened, fields lost, but the people lived, and Caleb, he returned to his ridge, patched the burn scars on the south wall with slate he'd stored beneath his crawl space, and resumed his walks. Same as always, the ridge was quiet again, until the stranger came with the book. The man arrived just after the rains came to clean the ash from the valley. He looked nothing like the railroad men or the settlers from the eastern towns who came to sketch Caleb's chimney cabin with pencils trembling in their gloved fingers. This stranger wore no boots, just soft shoes caked in road mud, and his jacket was linen, city-made, too fine for timber or wind. He carried no tools, only a satchel and a small book bound in worn leather. He never explained the science. He explained the shape. "How do you know where the warmth goes?" one boy asked. Caleb pointed to the trees. "Same way the sap climbs. You give it a trunk, it knows where to go." The lessons were strange, sometimes quiet for hours. He'd have them draw not buildings but paths, where heat would move if it had no eyes but wanted to reach a bed, where smoke would settle, where cold would press in. He made them feel it first, then build. By the next spring, A carpenter named Holson had created a cabin with staggered levels that looped in a spiral, each quarter turn a room, the center a brick shaft for smoke and air. It was the warmest building the town had seen. He called it the Spindle. Caleb visited once, didn't speak, just walked the spiral, tapped the vent lids, studied the slope. Then he nodded once, firm. "Wastes nothing," he said, and left. That summer was the last time anyone saw Caleb walk to town. He didn't take ill. He didn't disappear. He just stopped coming. People assumed he'd chosen solitude again, as he always did when the world pressed too close. But by winter, when the trails were too thick to walk and snow lay heavy across the pine roots, a single curl of smoke still rose from the top of River's Rise. Someone checked on him that February. A young boy, 15, eager to learn more, hiked the ridge with dry boots and a fresh drawing. He knocked, no answer. He entered. The cabin was warm, not hot, just gently, eternally warm. The stove was dark, the fire long out, and in the third room, Caleb sat in his chair, wrapped in wool, book open in his lap. He'd passed, peaceful, eyes closed like a man asleep in the sun. On the page before him were the last notes he'd written, simple, clean, without fuss. The secret isn't fire, the secret is shape. The wind takes what it can. Give heat nowhere to run, and it will stay. Let it climb. The town buried him on the ridge. They didn't build a monument. They built copies. Cabins across the valley adopted the full stack method. Bell hollows, draft bleeds, staggered rooms. The priest rewrote the church with timber he laid himself. The widow from Kansas raised her boys to become builders. The town never froze again, and long after the winds returned, people still came to see it. A tall, narrow cabin, 3 rooms stacked like stairs. No fire, still warm. Years passed. The valley changed in ways no one had imagined back when they'd first laughed at Caleb Rivers and his mad, narrow house. The railroad came through 2 ridges over, bringing more than lumber and steel. It brought people, settlers, speculators, engineers with square jaws and instruments no one had seen before. Men with maps in iron folders and blueprints rolled tight like scrolls. They asked 1,000 questions about building, heating, weather resistance. But when they stood before Caleb's cabin, they always fell silent. The structure still stood, unbothered, unchanged. Every now and then, someone would test the door or walk up the trail in deep winter just to place their bare palm on the side of the timber wall and marvel. It always felt warm, not hot, not radiant, just right, as if the cabin itself breathed, as if warmth had memory. The boy who had found Caleb that February, Peter Lantry, had grown into a young man by then. He was the first to take on Caleb's lessons and expand them, not replicate, not mimic, advance. He taught others, not from the same bench Caleb had used, but from a simple circle of stones on the ridge where a second structure now stood, a learning hall, circular, low to the ground, built with earth berms and vented downward as well as up. He called it the Keep Warm, and inside its walls hung dozens of Caleb's old diagrams, carefully redrawn, re-inked, and notated by hand, each one preserved in waxed paper, the edges weighted with stones. Visitors came from all over. Some were homesteaders hoping to survive another winter without losing their cattle. Others were architects who had heard rumors of passive heat systems in the wilderness that didn't rely on coal or boilers. A few were skeptics. One even laughed at first. Some factory man from back east who claimed no structure without metal insulation or circulating heat could maintain stability through a hard freeze. He stayed a week and left without a word. Peter never claimed to be Caleb. He said so plainly, "I only carry what was past." But he understood the deeper logic, the thing Caleb never put on paper but taught through action. Everything breathes, everything climbs. Warmth, like fear, like faith. It only needs the right shape to rise. The town had changed too. The old church was replaced with a multi-tiered meeting house built on a vertical layout, one that trapped warmth like a funnel in its rafters. Homes were no longer single-story sprawls. They rose now, 3 levels if you could afford it, 2 if you couldn't. Those who couldn't build vertically dug down and vented upward through layered stone. Even the schoolhouse had a drift stack room at its center, where children could warm between lessons without ever touching a stove. Some called it architecture, but in the town they called it Rivers Work, and that name meant more than heat. It meant humility, building not for pride but for survival, not for beauty but for keeping. At the western edge of the ridge, near a cluster of elder pines, they built a small monument, not for Caleb, but for the idea of him. It was a stone chimney, freestanding, with 3 timber steps stacked behind it, each one smaller than the last. Not a house, a memory. At its base they carved no dates, just one line: "Let the warmth climb." Children were told his story every winter, not as a legend, but as a lesson. They learned the numbers, how vent holes should never exceed 3 inches unless bridged by a draft control, how walls should never meet at bare right angles, because corners trap cold. How a stone laid beneath a stove is not just a platform, but a reservoir. They memorized how to braid rope-sealed door edges, how to bank coals in earthen pits, how to build not with haste but with intent. When a settler died from cold over the ridge the following decade, it was the first such death in 15 years. A tragic mistake. He'd ignored the designs, insisted on open floor plans and large windows for light. Peter said nothing to the papers. But that winter, the keep warm filled with more students than ever before, and still, the cabin stood, wind-polished now, the timber grey where once it had been warm brown. Moss had crept up the lower walls. The top room's vent cover had rusted, but it still opened, catching the sun in late afternoon like a signal fire. Inside, everything remained. The iron stove, the bell chamber beneath, the trap vents with their felt seals, the ladder to the second floor, the rope hoist to the third. No one lived there, but no one would dare tear it down. It became a rite of passage. If you wanted to learn the craft, you spent a night in the chimney cabin, alone, no fire, just the stones and the vents. You lay in the top room and waited, and when the warmth reached you, not from flame, but from the memory of flame, you understood. If you didn't feel it, you weren't ready. Some said Caleb still walked the ridge. Others said that was foolish talk. But one night, in the later hours of a deep freeze, a hunter named Rowe swore he saw smoke, thin, white, clean, rising from the top vent. He climbed the trail before dawn, found the stove cold, the bed undisturbed. But the cabin, it was warm. He slept there that night without even unrolling his pack. By the time the century turned, engineers had built entire towns using the stack design. One settlement near the rocky foothills was built entirely in descending tiers, each home connected to a central heat chamber beneath a tall, stone tower. They called the place Rivermark in his honor. A distant relative of the Price family, a professor from back east, tried to publish Caleb's story as a scientific theory, called it vertical thermodynamic sustainment. He filled volumes with formulas and citations. But in the frontier towns, it was still just Caleb's way, not a system, a shape. When Peter passed, his students took up the work. The Keep Warm became a formal school, one of the first wilderness academies focused solely on architectural endurance, not beauty, not luxury, just endurance. And yet, for all their advancements, for all the layers and devices and hollow bricks they added, none ever matched the balance of the original. Caleb's cabin remained unmatched, not because it had more, but because it had just enough. No waste, no excess, just warmth that climbed and never left. The chimney cabin still stands to this day, through storms, through wind, through fires and freeze, and though no one claims it as home, the door is never locked. If you come in winter, you'll find it ready, the stove cold, the rooms warm, the stairs rising, each level just like the last, but warmer, always warmer. And when you lie in the top room, and you hear no wind, and you feel no draft, and you breathe in the hush of a structure built not by guess, but by truth, then you'll understand what the neighbors never did, not when they laughed, not when they mocked, not even when they copied. You'll understand what Caleb knew the moment he cut the first beam. That warmth isn't fire, it's a place to go, and if you build it right, it always climbs.